All right. Hello, everybody. So our project is Challenging the Narrative Through Education. So a basic summary of our project is we're creating an alternative curriculum to combat Western-centric history in regards to the Civil Rights Movement. The use of Western-centric history is it's more of it's the Civil Rights Movement as kind of pandering to white people, and the focus on Martin Luther King Jr. as being, the pinnacle of the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement ended with Martin Luther King Jr. is kind of what's taught in schools now, and we want to change that. So to accomplish this, we're going to utilize written lesson plans along with a 15 to 20 minute podcast to complement the day's lessons plans. The lesson plans themselves are going to consist of different activities other than just lectures that address the different groups that were involved in the Civil Rights Movement, including LGBTQ+, women and children, religious movements, and other groups like the American Indian Movement that were either occurring during the Civil Rights Movement or were influenced by the commonly well-known Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s and the 1970s. So we were sort of, our influences for this project were based on the books that we read, and as well as the presentations that we heard and the presentations that we created. The biggest one was the Charleston syllabus, which my fellow presenter read. This one right here. In that it created a step-by-step guide on how it led up to the Charleston incident, and that's something that I think is important for creating a curriculum. Is you do have to kind of create what led up to that point. With White Flight and with Hillbilly Nationalism, which were both read by my colleague on my right. Oh yeah, and my colleague on my left as well, both of them. That was based off of that both of them create an alternate narrative that was previously ignored in literature, as well as in education regarding the Civil Rights Movement. It kind of goes into that idea of there was other stuff going on that is ignored in traditional high school education. When you learn about the Civil Rights Movement. With Peggy Kerr, who was one of the presenters, we were kind of influenced by how she talked about how the narrative is presented by the paper, and that presentation kind of guides how the narrative is interpreted by the people who are learning about it. So that was important. And then the SPLC, not so much the organization itself, but while we were doing research for our presentation, we did a lot of kind of digging into their teaching tolerance program, which was very, very robust, and it was very influential in terms of how we are kind of structuring our lesson plans, because they're not so much based on just lectures, but are more interactive in order to get kids involved in what's going on. It also was just based off of, it wasn't just one overarching teaching plan where it was like, okay, here's one teaching plan for everybody. It was based off of grades and where you are in schooling, so that everybody kind of had something tailored towards them. Going off of that, when we were creating what our project was going to be in terms of education, we kind of had to think of how we wanted it to look. And one of the things we talked about was the effectiveness of lectures. Lectures are argued to not be very effective as there's not a lot of interaction, which is why we look to using the podcast as the lecture. A lot of podcasts, as many of you know, can go up to 3 hours. We cut our podcast off at 15 to 20 minutes because that is when you are going to pay attention the most. This is in the first 15 to 20 minutes of the podcast. And by creating these podcasts that the students will listen to before the actual lesson, so the plan is if you're learning something on a Tuesday, you'll listen to the podcast on Monday night and discuss what you listened to on the Tuesday. It becomes more interactive for the students, and it encourages the lesson plans themselves to be more interactive as everybody's coming in on the same level of information, because everybody would have listened to the podcast the night before, hopefully.
So when talking about how we can kind of evaluate the success of our project, there's a couple different ideas of like the structure of success and kind of what that means. So looking at the success of the project itself is whether or not that these lesson plans will actually be put out to public use, which is our end goal, is that these will actually be used. This lesson plan, this curriculum is designed to be taken over the course of a week with, or kind of hopefully around the time of MLK Day or Martin Luther King Jr. Day, but it can occur whenever, so it's not like it's only based off of that. And we also want to discuss the use of the curriculum in local and non-local schools. My colleague has been in touch with some of the folks over at the Missoula International School, as well as a person at Northeastern High School in Philadelphia. So we've been kind of able to utilize these different connections in order to also receive feedback on our curriculum and maybe places that we can improve it, places that need to be changed, reorganized, especially because we're kind of trying to gear this more towards a high school level. But how can we take these different lesson plans and apply them to other grades as well? And then we also were thinking about how can we evaluate whether or not this project is successful in working to defeat white supremacy, and we really want to help to change the common narrative of the civil rights movement in schools. I know that growing up, going to a public school, I was taught that racism ended with Martin Luther King Jr., even though that is not the case, and that having that narrative in education can just help to promote white supremacy of, oh, everything's fine, we don't need to change anything. But in reality, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And yeah, so when looking at the social typography that we've been discussing in class, we kind of saw our project falling in two sort of main areas. So the project itself is the red line, Team Rocket. And so we saw our project of the curriculum and putting it out into the public space as something that is collective and public. As you know, we also, I know that my mom has been telling me about different websites that we can use to put our curriculum out there. So it's in a very public sphere. And then the blue line is the general use of the project if a teacher hopefully chooses to utilize the curriculum and apply it to their own school, because they can choose what they want to change and what they don't, and things like that. Next, please.
So how are we challenging white supremacy with this project? Number one is that we're presenting a new narrative of the civil rights movement that extends past Martin Luther King Jr. Basically, we're looking at separating the man from the myth. So the myth being that that racism ended with him and the civil rights movement ended with him as well. And then also, within this narrative, we're trying to connect it to ongoing civil rights movements today, such as Black Lives Matter and whatnot. And then, as my esteemed colleague said in the beginning, how the African American civil rights movement did inspire other movements such as the American Indian movement, the Chicano movement, and whatnot. Another thing that we were also considering was the fact that we are three white people creating a new narrative for the civil rights movement. So how do we combat white supremacy as three white people talking about these, talking about mainly people of color who were activists during this time? And one of the main ways that we looked at trying to resolve this issue was using sources by authors who are representative of that topic. So looking at the different efforts that were given by, for example, women and children, we're looking at using female authors and so on and so forth. And then again, reiterating this point from earlier, we're recognizing that racism did not end with the civil rights movement. So part of our curriculum and in our lesson plans, we're going to be looking at organizing our information and writing these lesson plans to pose questions that inspire critical thought about how the civil rights movement influenced later movements. And then also other critical questions similar to that to get students thinking a little bit more outside of the box and outside of the information that they're just given in their run-of-the-mill textbook.
So more specifically, yeah, some of the goals, I feel like we've said this quite a bit, is the challenging the existing narrative of the civil rights movement. And to the right is James Baldwin, and to the left is Fannie Lou Hamer. And we want to challenge the existing hero trope of Martin Luther King and bring some new light to some of the groups that were not always at the forefront of the history of the civil rights movement, especially through each day of this week-long lesson plan centering around a specific group that is oftentimes ignored. I know that I was not taught about all of the different involvements of other groups and the inspiration of the civil rights movement to other groups growing up. Like I had no idea about the Chicano movement or American Indian movement. I had no idea about those until coming to college, which is a problem, at least that I see. And so hopefully as well with some of our goals is that hopefully through speaking with actual people who are involved in education and things, we can hopefully get feedback as to how not only can we get this implemented in schools and have it be successfully implemented, but how we can actually be effective with this, because we're not necessarily qualified educators, but just how can we make sure that this is qualified, like that this is going to be effective and that we're on the right track with what we want to do. Yeah.
So the vision of the project, basically how we're working together to accomplish this, our end goal. Our individual tasks, we have each picked, so the project is split up into like a week, potentially 6 days worth of lesson plans, and each of us has taken on one of those days or one of those topics for lesson plans to write the lesson plan, which involves doing the research and designing the different worksheets the students will be using, as well as writing the accompanying podcast scripts. So we're each individually doing that for the topics that we have chosen. And then the group together, Team Rocket, will has decided on a lesson plan format that all the lesson plans will follow. And then we are together going to be recording and editing the podcast, as well as compiling the varying lesson plans, worksheets, etc., into a single space that is accessible for educators to access, such as a website or online database, etc., where my cohort's mother has given such valuable information on. And then together we're also going to be focusing on implementation of our curriculum. So as my other colleague was saying earlier, is that I was lucky to be able to make contact with a person in Northeastern High School in Philadelphia, which is the largest public high school in Philadelphia, with a person who is in charge of the department who actually writes the curriculum for that school. He is going to just give us pointers on who we should be focusing on adopting this curriculum, such as groups like boards of education, or if we should focus our efforts on individual educators, or looking at private schools, so on and so forth. And then, of course, we all work together on this presentation. So what we still need to be, what we are currently working on and what we still need to accomplish for this project is finish writing and recording the podcasts, which will be done in our podcast recording and editing studio at Mansfield Library, which I think is new, right?
Yeah.
Are we?
Yeah. It's new.
I think we're going to be the test dummies for it.
Yeah, we are the test dummies
Okay,
for it.
So that's exciting. We need to complete the lesson plans and then have a critical review of the material. I have talked to another professor on campus who specializes in race and inequality in education, and that person has agreed to review our material to make sure that it falls in line with our goal and our intent. We need to, once everything's completed, post lesson plans publicly. So basically the creation of a separate website to hold the lesson plans so educators can access them. And then, of course, as we were saying, implementation, so contact with the potential school sites, and then have the lesson plans accessible either as a full lesson plan or available as the different elements of the lesson plans for a week-long course, or so that educators can go in and pick and choose the different elements for what they need and choose to focus on with their students. And then we need to develop our strategy for implementation, which, as I was saying, involves talking to the gentleman from Philadelphia and then finding the best websites to make our curriculum most accessible to the public and whatever else comes with implementing this curriculum. Pulling back. So, as I mentioned before, we are three white people trying to design a curriculum that offers a new narrative to the civil rights movement. A little bit more into that background, we picked the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King because we wanted to tackle the Western-centric or Eurocentric history that is given in traditional history textbooks. And we thought that Martin Luther King would be a good focal point because he is looked at as this hero for the civil rights and is appeasing to, I guess, the white majority as a public figure during that time. So that's why we are focusing our curriculum on that topic specifically. So how do we, as three white people, combat white supremacy with the creation of this new narrative curriculum? What are your thoughts on that?
So we already suggest, or one thing that we are doing is looking at the specific, looking at works that are done by these specific groups, like women and LGBTQ.
African American authors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so looking at authors for this specific topics. Can you guys think of any other ways?
I do like what you have about addressing that you guys are three white people in the initial podcast. That's probably just a good idea so they know where they're getting their information from. Just being transparent, yeah. Then like the sources, good idea. Beyond that.
Yeah, I guess like a sub-question sort of going off of that is how do we incorporate the different diverse groups into our project as well? In either creating the curriculum or implementing the curriculum or advertising that it's available, things like that. The reason that we're asking this, I think, is because we're stuck at this point with this issue.
I mean, I do appreciate how you're holding yourselves accountable to like a professor that has agreed to work with you guys to kind of make sure that it is actually achieving your goals. And I think that recognizing this as a problem or like potential issue is really important, but I don't know if I can be like concrete.
Well, the one thing that we came up with was, as colleague A stated, was using resources from the people who are representative of the topics we're discussing, but because that also potentially limit us in the information that we're able to use or to portray in our curriculum.
I'm not sure I totally understand that. Are you like, is there like a topic that you want to address that you can't find information, or how does that limit? Sorry, I'm confused.
So no, not in that respect, but more limiting to if say we're talking about LGBTQ plus contributions toward the civil rights movement, and we only use resources that, like say, books that are written by authors who are a part of the LGBTQ plus community, are we limiting ourselves to and resources by only using contributions from that community?
I kind of worry that the project will have too many first sources, primary sources, as opposed to peer-reviewed secondary sources. If you do it strictly that way, just because a lot of people who research LGBTQ plus issues aren't necessarily part of the group themselves. I think if it's peer-reviewed and it's academically sound, then it shouldn't matter as much who it's written by if the content is good, especially if it's reviewed by peers, because then you can kind of tell that it's accurate and accepted. I don't know.
What are you concerned that you will misconstrue, or otherwise misrepresent because of your racial identities? What's at the core of your concern?
I personally am nervous that I will misrepresent the lived experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially coming from a personal place of privilege and then speaking on the experiences of, like, because the topic that I'm taking on is the women and children movement and the women children involvement, and it's like, as a person of privilege who's also just the only kind of relation that I have is like, I'm also a woman and identify as a cisgendered woman, and so I'm worried about people being like, oh, she's just a privileged white girl, but
I think you guys are kind of doing one of the biggest things that I see could combat that in recognizing your privileges that you have. I think that that's a really good way to kind of even people are gonna have those ideas anyway, oh, these three white people are talking about topics that they have no relation to. But if you say I recognize that I'm privileged and I'm not a complete expert in this, but I think that that's a really good first step.
So then do you think that it should be something that we address every single lecture podcast, or just in the first one? What do you think about that? If you have any ideas.
I would probably say at the beginning of each lecture, just because if you're not making it mandatory, if the other people who are going to be taking your project can pick and choose what parts fit them, then if the first part doesn't fit theirs, then they're not going to get that.
Right.
I think it's important to have it at each part.
Just a little intro.
Megan, can you answer the question as well?
Oh yeah. My biggest fear is that by us creating it as three white people is that we run the risk, if we don't do it correctly, of hijacking the narrative, which is my biggest fear, because we're three white people. We grew up, in the 21st century. We did not live this experience, as my esteemed colleague mentioned. And I feel that we need to, I don't want to say tread lightly, but it's something that we all are very concerned about, and we want to make sure that we do this right without taking the voice of this away from the people who actually lived it.
Okay, can I invite you to rise to a higher level of analysis about the way privilege might be operating in this project? My sense is that the historiography of the civil rights movement is incredibly robust. And the biases that you've named have been eradicated from that literature if you're dealing with secondary sources. You don't have to worry about that. The voices, particularly from groups like SNCC, from the authors of color, it's just incredibly robust. Those biases have long been just sort of shoved away. I think the bias you really need to look at is your pedagogy here. And to pay much more attention, put much more energy, and be concerned about how are the pedagogical methods you're developing going to affect with a diverse audience of students. That's where I think your issues really have to be paying attention to in terms of the kind of assumptions you're making about access to podcasts, assumptions you're making about the kind of discussion questions that'll be effective in diverse classrooms, the way in which you develop your methodologies of engagement around those issues, I think that's where the biases are going to be far more problematic than the historiography itself. You all have access to that. It's incredibly robust. That's like a solution. That's my 2 cents on it. But I think you do have to pay attention to it there.
And kind of building off that in terms of access, because education itself is very diverse and kind of where it could be used. Like, I think that the lens that you take in explaining it would have to shift depending on the audience, and so maybe including kind of a disclaimer for whoever is going to pull from this that they need to examine their classroom and the audience within their classroom, and maybe providing a little bit of wiggle room for your lesson plans. Because there are schools that are predominantly white, and then there are schools that, there's variation within the school, so kind of looking to see how that could shift as well.
Or you could just focus the project on having it be a lesson plan for schools that are predominantly white, like they are locally. Just because I feel like if you're trying to make, that would essentially be like a bunch of different kinds of lesson plans that you would have to make and a bunch of different kinds of discussion questions. And I wonder how easy it would be to access the resources you would need or access the knowledge that you would need to cater those lessons plans to demographics that we're not necessarily familiar to or have access to in Montana.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, that's good, yeah.
Do you want to go to discussion part 2? So this is more of like a nitpicky thing that my colleague over here said that I had an existential crisis over yesterday. Because the word choice is difficult because, and I find it to be important because what we're looking at is offering a new narrative to a Eurocentric curriculum, and that could potentially give the wrong message of what the intent of this curriculum actually is. Because Eurocentric, somebody who sees that word might consider it to be something centered to Europe, not toward like its American history. And we were also debating about the term white-centric, but feel as though that might be that might also alienate certain groups of people when we talk about biolinguist white-centric sort of curriculum. So can anybody help us identify a better term for than Eurocentric? Yeah.
I don't have a suggestion quite yet. I was hoping you could elaborate on that. I don't know if I just misunderstood, but earlier you were talking about the Eurocentric view of the civil rights movement, and that, I mean, I think that's what you're saying too, is that it's like confusing and it doesn't line up. But I was also wondering, there was like a specific example of like the Eurocentric view of Martin Luther King Jr. And I was really confused by what you guys meant at that. So are you talking about like you want to break into Eurocentric curriculum like within social studies classes, or is there like what you see as a Eurocentric view on the civil rights movement specifically?
So
Mostly looking at history, but
it was, that was a word choice. It's, which is what the existential crisis was I alluded to about my colleague. It's the idea that the current narrative of the civil rights movement is geared towards one that is the most acceptable to white people. And that is what we're attempting to combat. So it's not, I don't want to call it the safe and sane version, but the...
So I think it's sort of like, we're going after this based on this notion that racism is institutionalized in the country, yes. And part of that racism exists within the traditional curriculum that is present in public schools, and the school system being an institution caters to the history of the predominant white culture. So that's where we're coming from when we're talking about the Eurocentric.
Yeah, that makes sense. So now, sorry, can I keep going? Okay, so now the train of thought I'm kind of on is like, these concepts are really big and you guys are focusing on high school, right?
Yes.
I think these concepts are even kind of big for high school. Because I think about a lot of the terms you're using in this presentation, they make sense to me and I'm sure
Yeah.
they make sense to the rest of the room because we've been studying this more. I was not exposed to a lot of that stuff until like the last 2 years. So I understand what you're getting at, but I almost wonder if it needs to be synthesized more because you're talking about combating these traditional narratives, these
Yeah.
narratives that white people have elevated because they see them as acceptable. Like, I know one of the big things is white people love to be like, Martin Luther King Jr. didn't agree with violence, you know,
Yeah.
and related arguments. So I wonder if it would almost be more, did you like my white people invitation? So I almost wonder if it would be more effective to synthesize what you're trying to say and kind of this idea, just straightforward, things are not always as they seem. And like slowly introduce this concept of white centrism. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's something that we're looking at. For the first day, it's like a basic kind of introduction. We even have like a vocabulary list that we're building of like, what do we mean when we say intersectionality? What do we mean when we say this kind of? So we do have that in day one. So it kind of hopefully.
Yeah, we're kind of using the big words in the presentation because we do know that most people in the room know what it means.
Yeah.
We're not going to use the big words without, a definition for the high schoolers.
Okay.
Big words, I think, if we do use them in our implementation of the project, it would be more for the educators to read about what the project is,
Yeah.
to see if that is a useful tool for them to use in their classroom.
Okay.
But yeah, no, I agree with you that it's, I think, using a more advanced sort of scholarship, if you will, would also sort of alienate the intended audience. Yeah. Thank you.
And that kind of goes back to the pedagogy stuff that we were talking about.
Maybe to also clarify this question a little bit, because I'm now realizing that perhaps it's not worded in the clearest way. I do have a definition here of Eurocentric, and it says, and this is what this definition I'm operating on by asking this question here. It says, Eurocentric is focusing on European culture or history to the exclusion of a wider view of the world, implicitly regarding European culture as preeminent. So that's what I'm talking about.
So is kind of the problem here, you guys feel that the term most accurately would be white-centric, however, you run into issues with white fragility, so you're kind of forced to use Eurocentric instead, but then it kind of muddles the intention of it?
Pretty much.
Yep.
Okay.
About like Western-centric,
Yeah, we thought about that as well.
but also the West includes people of color.
Yeah.
So that's,
There's also the term, which isn't commonly used in the United States, but Occidentalism history, which is sort of juxtaposed to like, it's a term that's used for Western culture, it's Occidental.
But then again, you run into the problem of
But who knows what that means?
Yeah.
You had your hand up like 5 minutes.
I think that if you're worried about white-centric as far as educators looking at it and being like, that hurts my white fragility, I think the kind of educators who would be using your lesson plans and looking for resources like this would not be offended by that term. And I think if they were offended by that term, they would be more offended by the lesson plans themselves and would teach them based off of that.
I guess what my goal would be is to reach the people who would be offended by that term by using a more neutral term, so that they can read, you know what I
I
mean?
just think that they would dive into the actual lesson plan and say, oh, they think that white people rewrote history, and then they would immediately just be turned off. Like, the kind of people that would be offended by that term, I don't think would be able to make it through the lesson plans.
I think they would be offended regardless. Like,
Yeah.
It's just not going to appeal to them regardless. I don't think you guys should steer clear of using the.
Because it is the clearest word.
Yeah,
I feel.
It's a horribly awkward word.
Yeah.
It just
Yeah.
doesn't work.
It doesn't
as a
flow.
word.
Yeah.
That's my problem with
Why
it.
not-
It just is awkward.
Why not just ethnocentric?
What?
I like it.
Oh, yeah.
That works.
I mean, you could, a word, that expression that's used in other settings is the master narrative.
Oh, I like that one.
And having an alternative to the master narrative, and deliberately master as in slave master, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it evokes that, but it doesn't get into some of the same traps that the awkward
I like
phrase of
that
white
one.
centric. So I mean, that's what I use when I talk about
We were also discussing a term similar to that as hegemony.
it. Again, yeah, that works. It sounds academic.
Nice.
Yeah.
People are same master narrative.
Yeah, I like master narrative a lot.
Were you going
Did you have your hand up?
No, yeah, I was saying that I thought there would be a different word that could be more helpful.
Yeah,
I don't know. I thought we could have a brainstorm session real quick.
that's what we were hoping for.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were stuck yesterday, history of something.
It was more me, so thank you for entertaining my special question. What else do you guys think about this project?
I just have this is coming from my own like ignorance about like I went to an alternative high school. I'll put that out there first of all. And so I like don't have a good idea of what public education lesson plan or even private education lesson plan looks like. I sat at a computer and did my schoolwork at my alternative high school. And so I'm just wondering like, as far as I know, like how I conceive of the idea of high school education is that it's very mandated. And like, so there's things that have to be covered, and so it's very condensed and people have very little control over what they're doing. So, I mean, from that, how do you guys suggest that you're going to like put this into a lesson plan that's like very constrained, you know? You know what I mean? Yeah.
I completely agree with you, and from what I understand about the mandate on covering certain material in high school curriculum, just from the people I've talked to regarding this project, is that they have to cover the civil rights movement and talk about these people. And so I think what we're trying to do is talk about those people in a different way that also sheds light on many other groups of people to give credit where credit's due, sort of, you know?
Yeah, it's the mandate that the knowledge has to be, that certain things have to be hit. It doesn't mandate how that knowledge is given, which is why you see kind of this wide span depending on even what, you know, school you go to on how certain things are taught.
Yeah, because we both went to public school, but we had different teachings of the, we all three went to public high school. But, and from what I remember is that everything that we talked about in my AP US history classes is that everything was very like structured in like a time frame. So it's like, you know, you did this era and then you moved to this era and then you moved to this. So in a way, you know, we are still providing like a general kind of like time frame, you know, but we're like the story's much bigger than Martin Luther King, and like he gave his speech and then that was it, and then we never discussed it again. So
I have another question too.
Sure.
That's fine. So I definitely can imagine that students will go home and tell their parents and say, here's what I learned in school today. And then I guarantee you some of those parents are going to say, no, absolutely not. And then march into the school and complain. How do you, and I would guess that some teachers would be privy to that before they accept this lesson plan. So like, do you have something in mind that you can like give them to combat that, or like, how are you going to address that?
So there we go.
I mean, as you kind of said, one part of it is the teacher, when they choose to teach these lesson plans, it's a risk you choose to take. At the same time, it's the material that we're choosing to cover isn't. It can be called, certain parents might see it as controversial, but I think that when it came down to a school, when meeting with a principal, I don't think that it would be seen as such. And I mean, you do always run the risk of parents pulling their kids from lesson plans. I definitely had kids who had their parents pull them out for certain topics that we covered in certain history classes. But it's a plan that we kind of need to work on in terms of how do we, address it.
Can I add to that real quick? So another thing that we're doing as well is providing a list of resources that are sort of extracurricular to the actual material that we provide. So if you would like, for example, it'll say, if you would like more information on this topic, please refer to these list of books, these videos that you can find easily on YouTube, or to things like that as well. That will go into further depth about that specific topic that the parents can also have access to as well. And then another thing that we're also trying to focus on as much as possible is remaining as neutral as possible in the actual lesson plans themselves with the material that we're trying to cover. So that also will hopefully help prevent any sort of action like that. I don't think fully it will happen. Whereas then I think the schools will have to resort to their own internal systems to sort of combat that scenario.
Yeah, I really think that it's something that's important to keep in mind, just in kind of dealing with this, because I grew up in a smaller community. My parents were both in education, and I served on the school board. And there was an instance in which a couple of parents came in complaining about what was written in a social studies book because it was talking about Islam and like different practices of Islam and Muslims, and they were mad about it because of all the like kind of socially charged issues, and didn't think that it should be talked about in school and stuff like that. So while it may seem minute, there are people out there that are willing to bring it to like the school board or to principals or to, and sometimes that can take footing, especially in white-centric, I know that's a weird word, but like in communities with a majority, dominant, communities. So a disclaimer or maybe a way of kind of a guideline for the teachers in handling this, because also I've had a lot of conversations, I still keep in touch with a lot of people, and history itself, like the teachers themselves don't know this information, and so if it's new to them, they might not know how to handle it as well, so kind of preparing them to be able to combat that, but also using it as a mechanism of convincing them that this is the proper narrative that should be talked about, and kind of emphasizing the importance of rewriting the narrative, because you kind of have to get the teachers to buy in first, and they have to see the purpose before they're going to kind of revamp their plans for the year, because a lot of teachers kind of build a plan and kind of maintain that plan, especially in the AP curriculum, because they're preparing kids for the test. So just kind of keeping that in mind.
And we can probably also discuss it with your person over in Philadelphia too. If he has, if he has
Which is an
suggestions.
interesting point, because Philadelphia school systems, I just learned through talking, my cousin who lives in Philadelphia, actually this is important for this, but she lives just on the border right over like the street, the border that makes up the border between Philadelphia and this town called Jenkintown. And her kids go to a suburban school called Abington High School. And the reason that's significant is that Philadelphia schools, all schools, public and private, now require, as of last year, a full year of African American history for all high school students, which I think is phenomenal. And however, the suburban schools where her kids are going offer a half-year elective in African American history. And they're literally like, I don't know if you've ever been to an East Coast city, but they literally just run into the towns, and there's like no definitive border there. So you're pretty much part of the same community, but there's different expectations placed on the curriculum between those communities. So that would be a really interesting question to ask this gentleman in Northeastern High School in Philly on what strategies they use to combat this sort of backlash from parents. And also going on that, the other resource that we have here on campus, the professor who looks at, who specializes in race inequality in education, I'm taking a class from this person, and there is an article actually about how curriculum and education that is representative of different diverse cultures and groups is beneficial to not only diverse students, but also white students. And the article proves really valid points that perhaps we could make available to people who questioned the motives behind this sort of curriculum. Or something along those lines.
Yeah.
That sort of argument.
Yeah, and I'm sure that like for this, because it's smaller scale, like inserting it within their curriculum would be okay, but it is a lot of work to kind of change curriculum.
Yeah,
Mhm.
there's so many public and private schools.
Yeah, but like even just individually,
Mm-hmm.
it takes a lot for like within
And
high school.
kind of going back to what you said about like the AP classes, I think it's easier to acknowledge that it's going to be a lot harder for those teachers to insert it just because that
Yeah.
curriculum is far more
Restricted.
restrictive just because of
Yeah.
the lead up to the test.
Yeah, they teach for the test.
Yeah, and yeah,
Which is problematic within itself. But
yeah,
Right.
that's another issue.
And we're definitely not suggesting that we're gonna change every single, like, the curriculum, like, right now.
And that was another reason why we decided to
Yeah.
focus on just Martin Luther King, because it was the smallest step that we could see taking that would have a potentially substantial impact.
So as promised, you get at least one obnoxious question from me for a
Excellent.
presentation. You haven't got it yet, just so you know, this is happening now. What makes you think that education is going to do any good whatsoever to a bunch of high schoolers or maybe upper middle school students who get this thing thrown at them from 3 white students in the University of Montana? How do you have the gall to think this is going to make any difference whatsoever?
So glad you asked. Thank you for
I
that very important question.
I can speak from personal experience of not having any sort of curriculum like this, and then as soon as I get to college, be like, everything that you knew is wrong, and I felt like the just stupidest person. So I would argue that it helps to broaden a mindset, and maybe it is bold, but trying to kids from looking like idiots.
I mean, my first response is, we may not succeed with every kid, but we can certainly try.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it might not work for everybody, but there's, in a classroom of like 30 kids, there's going to be, it may not hit 30 kids, but it could certainly work with 5 or 6, and that's not a lot, but it is certainly a move in the right direction.
To give you a psychological standpoint on this, if we're gearing our curriculum to teenagers, essentially, people in high school, they're in developmental stage where they are, their brains are developing into the prefrontal cortex, which creates this abstract thought process. And by offering a curriculum that is diverse in its nature, by incorporating different diverse groups and contributions from diverse groups, it contributes to the development of that abstract thought in America's youth. And so I think that is important enough to at least try implementing a curriculum as such. And then also from a personal experience, coming to college and starting at the age of 33 was the first time I was ever exposed to any sort of alternative curriculum other than the, what do you call it, master narrative. Yeah, the master narrative. And it's completely changed my worldview, and it's almost like I have a sense of being robbed from this other experience that I could have been offered at such a younger age. So I think gearing our curriculum to the high school level and focusing on that age will provide a better insight and more holistic worldview for the students who are engaged within that curriculum.
Hopefully it can spark more questions with the younger youths. Questions.
Any more questions for our presenters? All right. No applause. Okay. Let's wait till we get done with